They called it mercy when humans left, then realized it was a warning part. 1. The gentle departure Chief Administrator Rennick of the Galactic Assembly stood before the Grand Council chamber, his crystalline form refracting light across the assembled representatives. His voice resonated through the vast hall with the authority of someone who had governed for 3 centuries. The decision is final. Humanity will be removed from the Galactic Assembly. This is not punishment. This is mercy. The chamber remained silent. Representatives from 847 different worlds watched as the resolution appeared on their displays. The vote had been overwhelming. Only 23 had voted against removal. The rest had agreed that humanity was too disruptive, too chaotic, too fundamentally incompatible with the order that had maintained peace across the galaxy for millennia. Rennick continued, his tone carefully modulated to convey both firmness and compassion. Humanity has contributed much during their brief membership. We acknowledge this. But their methods create instability. Their emotions cloud judgment. Their unpredictability threatens the systems we have built over eons. For their own good and ours, separation is necessary. On the outer edge of the Assembly's territory, on a medical station orbiting the gas giant Heliocenine, Dr. David Chen received the notification while treating a Vexorian child. The message appeared on his personal display, brief and formal. His hands didn't shake. He finished applying the regenerative gel to the child's wounded arm with the same careful attention he always gave. The child's mother, a tall Vexorian with iridescent scales, watched him with her large amber eyes. Is something wrong, doctor? David smiled gently. No, nothing wrong. Your daughter will heal perfectly. Keep the bandage clean and come back in 3 days. The mother hesitated. I heard something on the news feeds. About humans leaving? Yes. David's smile didn't falter. We're being asked to return to our own space. It's okay. Everything will be fine, but who will treat Syrah? You're the only doctor who understood her condition. David had spent 6 months figuring out why the Vexorian child's immune system was attacking her own tissue. It was a rare condition that standard protocols couldn't address. He had combined treatments from 4 different medical traditions, added something from human medicine that had no name in any alien language, created a therapy that worked. I'm writing everything down, David assured her. Every detail. The new doctor will be excellent. I'll make sure of it. Over the next 2 weeks, David worked almost without sleep. He documented every case, every unusual treatment, every instinct-based decision he had made. He knew the replacement doctor would be competent, skilled, trained in the best medical facilities the Assembly offered. He just hoped all the small, human intuitions could be translated into words. Across the sector on the industrial hub of Karth 7, engineer Sarah Okonkwo stood in the massive reactor control room, teaching her replacement how to read the systems. The Drennan engineer was thorough and intelligent, taking careful notes on every procedure. And this gauge here, Sarah pointed to a display that showed coolant flow. The official reading says normal range is between 7.2 and 8.1, but actually you want to keep it closer to 7.4. Why? The Drennan asked. If the range is acceptable, why maintain such a narrow margin? Sarah hesitated. Because the system runs smoother that way. It's hard to explain. You kind of feel it after a while. When it drifts toward 8, there's a vibration. Nothing the sensors pick up, but you can feel it in the floor if you pay attention. The Drennan looked confused. The sensors are designed to detect any anomaly. If they register normal, the system is functioning correctly. Probably. Sarah agreed. But just trust me on this one. Keep it at 7.4. She spent 3 weeks going through every system. Every quirk, every small adjustment she made daily that kept the reactor running at optimal efficiency. The Drennan documented everything, but Sarah could see the confusion in his expression. He didn't understand why a human would trust feeling over data, instinct over sensors. On the diplomatic station Unity Prime, Ambassador James Park sat across from a Thorian trade minister. Mediating their final dispute before his departure, the Thorian and a Kelvin merchant had been arguing for 2 weeks over a contract violation. Both sides had valid points. Both sides were absolutely convinced they were right. Let me see if I understand, James said quietly. You agreed to deliver 50,000 units by the third moon cycle. You delivered 48,000 units on time and the remaining 2,000 units 1 week late. Correct. The Kelvin merchant gestured emphatically. The contract specified third moon cycle. Late delivery costs me customers, damages my reputation. I demand compensation. The Thorian trade minister's feathers ruffled with agitation. We delivered 96% on time. The delay was due to a solar storm that no one could predict. We should not be penalized for natural phenomena. James had mediated hundreds of disputes like this. The assembly had protocols, procedures, legal frameworks. He could apply them and render a judgment that would be technically correct. Instead, he did what humans always did. He looked at both parties and asked a simple question. Do you want to work together again in the future? Both aliens blinked in surprise. The Kelvin spoke first. This merchant has quality goods. I would consider future business if terms are clear, and I value reliable customers. The Thorian admitted, but I cannot accept being penalized for circumstances beyond my control. James nodded. Then here's what I suggest. The late delivery caused real problems. That needs to be acknowledged. How about a 5% discount on the delayed shipment, and the merchant agrees to priority status on your next 3 orders? That way you get compensation for the inconvenience. You get assurance of better service going forward. He watched both aliens consider this. The Assembly's legal framework would have awarded full compensation or none at all. It would have been about right and wrong, not about relationship. But humans understood that business was built on trust, not just contracts. Both parties agreed. They even shared a traditional gesture of partnership before leaving. James wrote up the resolution, knowing his replacement would need examples of how to handle these situations. He doubted the examples would help. You couldn't teach someone to care about relationships over rules. Either you understood it or you didn't. All across assembly space, similar scenes repeated. Humans closed their businesses, finished their projects, said their goodbyes. They were teachers and technicians, doctors and diplomats, merchants and mediators. They had been part of the galaxy for only 150 years, a brief moment in galactic history. But they had spread far in that time, on the massive cargo station Crosspoint Alpha. Captain Maria Torres supervised the loading of the last human freighter. She had run trade routes through this sector for 20 years. She knew every dock worker, every customs official, every small merchant who used the station. A young Peluvian dock worker approached her nervously. Captain Torres, I wanted to thank you. For everything, Maria smiled at him. For what, Ken? You gave me a job when no one else would. You taught me how to operate the loading equipment. You helped my family when my father was sick, Maria waved dismissively. That's just being decent. Anyone would have done the same. No, Ken said quietly. No one else did. Only you. Maria felt a lump in her throat but kept smiling. You're going to be fine, Ken. You're good at your job. Better than I was at your age? Will humans come back? Maria looked at the stars visible through the massive station windows. I don't know. Maybe someday. But right now, we're going home. The exodus took 60 days, exactly as prescribed by the Assembly Directive. Human ships gathered at designated departure points, forming convoys that would travel together back to human space. There were cargo vessels, medical ships, exploration craft, personal shuttles, diplomatic transports. Thousands of ships, each carrying people who had made lives among the stars. Admiral Richard Assay commanded the final departure convoy. His flagship, the Persistence, led a fleet of 347 vessels. As they approached the boundary of assembly space, he stood on his bridge and watched the border marker grow larger on his displays. His second officer, Commander Lisa Ibarra, stood beside him. Permission to speak freely, Admiral? Always are we making a mistake? Leaving without protest? Without demanding reconsideration? We just accepted their decision and walked away. Richard was quiet for a long moment. What would protest accomplish? They voted. They decided we could have fought it, argued, made accusations. We could have made them force us out. But what would that prove? That we deserve to be here? That we're not inferior? Richard shook his head. We know we're not inferior. We don't need to prove it. And forcing them to drag us out screaming would just confirm their belief that we're too emotional, too chaotic. Sometimes the most powerful statement is acceptance. The persistence crossed the border, and the rest of the fleet followed. Behind them, the great border gates closed, sealing off assembly space. Richard watched the gates disappear from his sensors and felt an unexpected sense of peace. They were going home. After 150 years of trying to fit into someone else's vision of civilization, they were going home. In the Assembly Council chamber, Rennick watched the final human ship cross the border. Around him, representatives from across the galaxy relaxed visibly. The tension that had existed for months, the debates and arguments about humanity's place in the Assembly, all of it dissolved. It is done, Rennick announced. Humanity has departed peacefully. We can now focus on restoring order and stability. The Kelvin representative stood. I move that we redistribute human territories and responsibilities, according to standard protocols. Seconded. A Thorian voice called out. The motion passed unanimously. Committees were formed to divide up the work humans had been doing. Trade routes were reassigned. Medical facilities were restaffed. Diplomatic posts were filled. Security positions were allocated. Everything humans had built or managed was distributed among assembly members. It all looked good on paper. The plans were thorough, the allocations fair, the procedures proper. The assembly had been managing galactic civilization for tens of thousands of years. They knew what they were doing. On Helios Neen. The new doctor arrived to take over David Chen's clinic. Dr. Venn was a Solarite, highly trained, experienced, competent. He reviewed David's notes carefully, impressed by their thoroughness. The human had documented everything with meticulous detail. The Vexorian child? Syrah came for her follow-up appointment. Dr. Venn examined her, checked the treatment protocol David had created, and continued the therapy exactly as prescribed. Everything went perfectly. The child was healing. 3 weeks later, Syrah developed a fever. Dr. Venn ran tests and found nothing wrong. He consulted David's notes. They mentioned that Vexorian children sometimes develop temporary fevers during regenerative treatment and that this was normal. He told the mother not to worry. The fever got worse. Dr. Venn increased monitoring, but followed protocol. David's notes said fevers were normal. 4 days later, Syrah went into shock. Her body was rejecting the treatment. Dr. Venn managed to stabilize her. The regenerative therapy had to be stopped. He reviewed David's notes again, more carefully this time. Buried in a side comment, he found a note that said, watch for fevers above 38.5 degrees. At that point, pause treatment and adjust the Kelleron compound by 15%. Resume once fever subsides. The note was marked as important, but Dr. Venn had missed it in the hundreds of pages of documentation. Syrah survived but would need months of additional treatment. Dr. Venn filed a report about the incident, feeling frustrated. The human had tried to document everything, but there was too much information, too many small details, too many instincts that couldn't be fully explained. On Karth 7, the Drennan engineer maintained the reactor exactly according to procedure. He kept the coolant flow within the acceptable range of 7.22, 8.1. He ignored the subtle vibrations that sometimes occurred when the flow drifted toward the upper limit. The sensors showed everything was normal. 6 weeks after Syrah Okonkwo left, the reactor experienced a cascade failure. Nothing catastrophic, but serious enough to shut down the entire facility for 3 days. Investigation found that the cooling system had developed microscopic stress fractures from vibrations that the sensors hadn't detected. The vibrations had been within acceptable parameters, but constant enough to cause cumulative damage. The engineering report mentioned that the previous human engineer had maintained unusually narrow coolant flow parameters. The report suggested this might have prevented the stress fractures, but offered no explanation for why the human had done this. The official conclusion was that Syrah had been overly cautious. perhaps excessively worried about problems that standard protocols adequately addressed. On Unity Prime, Ambassador Park's replacement faced his first major trade dispute. A Thorian merchant and a Kelvin buyer were arguing over a contract. The new ambassador, a crystalline named Vex, reviewed the case carefully. He consulted legal precedents, analyzed the contract terms, and applied proper judicial reasoning. His ruling was technically perfect. The Thorian was found at fault for late delivery. The Kelvin was awarded full compensation. Both parties accepted the ruling as legally sound. They also immediately ended their business relationship. The Thorian merchant withdrew from the Kelvin trade network entirely. The Kelvin buyer lost access to high-quality goods. Both sides were angry, feeling they had been treated unfairly despite the legal correctness of the ruling. Ambassador Vex filed his report, noting that both parties had complied with the ruling. He didn't understand why they seemed dissatisfied. The law had been followed. Justice had been served. What more could they want? At Crosspoint Alpha, the new operations manager implemented proper scheduling protocols for dock workers. Everyone was assigned shifts according to optimal efficiency algorithms. Ken, the young Peluvian, found himself working with different teams every week, never building relationships, never developing familiarity with his coworkers. His performance declined. He made small mistakes, missed details, showed up late. The manager reprimanded him according to protocol. Ken apologized but seemed distracted. When Captain Torres had been there, she had noticed when he was troubled. She had asked about his family, offered help, made him feel valued. The new manager only cared about efficiency metrics. Ken quit after 2 months. The manager hired a replacement who was more reliable. The system worked exactly as designed. No one noticed that morale across the station was slowly dropping, that workers seemed less engaged, that the sense of community Maria Torres had built was dissolving. 3 months after humanity's departure, Chief Administrator Rennick reviewed reports from across assembly space. Everything looked acceptable on paper. Human duties had been redistributed. Systems were running. Life continued. But there were small anomalies. Medical facilities reporting slightly higher mortality rates. Industrial facilities experiencing more technical incidents. Trade volumes declining. Border security requiring more resources. Scientific research producing fewer breakthroughs. None of it was dramatic. None of it was crisis level. Just small decreases in efficiency, small increases in problems. The kind of variations that could be attributed to normal fluctuations. Rennick noted the trends, but wasn't concerned. The assembly had been managing the galaxy for millennia. They knew temporary adjustments were normal after major changes. Things would stabilize. He didn't know that across the galaxy, beings were beginning to notice something missing. A quality they couldn't name, a presence they hadn't valued until it was gone. The humans had left softly, without anger or violence. Without protests or demands, their absence was beginning to speak. And what it was saying would soon become impossible to ignore. The unraveling 6 months after humanity's departure. The cracks became impossible to ignore. Chief Administrator Rennick sat in his private chamber, surrounded by holographic displays showing reports from across assembly space. Every display showed red indicators. Every sector reported problems. What had been small anomalies 3 months ago had grown into systemic failures. The first major incident occurred on the Deep Space Station Nexus 8. The station housed 45,000 beings from various species, all working in the mining operations that extracted rare elements from a nearby asteroid field. The life support system began experiencing cascading failures. Station Director Krall, a methodical Drennan, stood in the emergency command center watching his engineers work frantically. Every backup system they activated failed within hours. Every repair they made held for days before collapsing again. How is this possible? Krall demanded. These systems were designed with triple redundancy. We have the best engineers in the assembly. His chief engineer, a Thorian named Vess, pulled up the maintenance history. Director, I found something. There was a human technician assigned here for 8 years. Michael Santos. He implemented something called adaptive maintenance. What does that mean? Vess looked uncomfortable. He didn't follow the standard maintenance schedule. Instead, he monitored the systems constantly and performed maintenance based on what he called feel. He would repair things before they broke, replace parts that technically had operational life remaining, adjust parameters that were within acceptable ranges. That's inefficient, Krall said. Wasteful, perhaps, but the station never had a major system failure in 8 years. Since he left, we've had 12. They evacuated Nexus 8. It took 4 days and cost the assembly millions in emergency response. Engineers eventually discovered that the life support systems had been cobbled together. From parts manufactured by 7 different species, standard maintenance protocols didn't account for how these different technologies interacted. Michael Santos had apparently understood these interactions instinctively and adjusted his maintenance accordingly. His replacement had followed protocols exactly. The protocols were wrong. On the medical world of Sanctuary 5, Dr. Yana faced a crisis that made her question everything she had learned in 20 years of practice. A plague had broken out among the Vexorian population. A mutated version of a virus that shouldn't have been dangerous. She followed every treatment protocol. She consulted the best medical databases. She brought in specialists from across the assembly. The mortality rate was 40%. For a species with advanced medical technology, it was a disaster. In desperation, she searched the records for any previous outbreak. She found one from 9 years ago, treated by a human doctor named David Chen. His mortality rate had been 7%. Dr. Yana studied David's records obsessively. He had used treatments that made no sense. He combined medications from different medical traditions that protocols said shouldn't be mixed. He adjusted dosages based on notes like patient seemed tired, or family reported appetite changes, or just had a feeling. How did he know this would work? Yana asked her colleague, Dr. Shendot. He didn't, Shen replied, reading the notes. He was guessing, experimenting. These treatments weren't tested or approved, but they worked once. They worked once. We can't base medical practice on one human's lucky guesses. Yana tried to replicate David's approach, but without his instinct for reading patients, the results were poor. 187 Vexorians died who might have lived. The plague eventually ran its course, but the death toll haunted her. Somewhere in David Chen's notes was the key to saving those lives. But she couldn't translate human intuition into Thorian logic. The economic crisis started quietly, but accelerated rapidly. Trade networks that had functioned smoothly for decades began collapsing. The problem wasn't obvious at first. Ships still moved goods. Contracts were still fulfilled. But the volume of trade was dropping month by month. Trade Minister Porvan of the Kelvin Consortium stood before the Assembly Council, trying to explain what was happening. The outer colonies are refusing to trade with assembly merchants. They claim our terms are unfair. The terms are identical to what they accepted before. Rennick pointed out, we simply redistributed the trade routes that humans were managing. Yes, Administrator. But the humans had relationships with these colonies, personal connections. They extended credit during difficult times. They accepted losses to maintain partnerships. That's inefficient business practice. A crystalline representative interjected. Trade should be based on fair exchange, not sentiment. Perhaps, Porvan said carefully. But the colonies trusted the humans. They don't trust us. We offer contracts. They want relationships. Then they'll learn to adapt. Rennick said firmly. The Assembly has managed trade for millennia. The colonies need our goods. They'll accept our terms, but they didn't. The outer colonies began trading with each other, forming independent networks that excluded assembly merchants. They hoarded resources rather than sell to traders they didn't trust. Some colonies faced shortages. Some assembly merchants faced bankruptcy. The economic system was reshaping itself. The assembly couldn't control it. Security incidents increased across every border. The Drax Raiders, peaceful for 2 decades, began testing defenses. Pirate groups that had been dormant suddenly became active. Unexplored territories that humans had mapped and secured became dangerous again. General, Turk of the Assembly Defense Forces reviewed the reports with growing frustration. His forces won every engagement. His tactics were flawless. His soldiers were well trained, but the enemy kept coming. Why aren't they deterred? He demanded of his strategic advisor. The advisor, a tactical AI named Oracle, displayed probability matrices. The enemy has calculated that assembly forces are predictable. We follow doctrine. We respond according to protocols. Our enemies have learned our patterns, then we change our patterns. Our doctrine is based on thousands of years of strategic evolution. Changing it risks creating vulnerabilities. Turk pulled up records from when human security forces had managed these same borders. The humans had experienced far fewer incidents. Their tactical reports were confusing, full of phrases like mixed it up and kept them guessing and went with my gut. One report from a human commander named Kyle Martinez stood out. The Drax Raiders hit the western perimeter 3 times. I predicted they'd try the same approach on the eastern side, so I repositioned forces against protocol. The Raiders arrived expecting standard deployment. They retreated without engaging when they found us waiting in unexpected positions. General, Turk tried to implement similar tactics, but his commanders were trained to follow doctrine. When he ordered unexpected deployments, his officers questioned the orders, debated the wisdom, sought clarification. By the time they moved, the element of surprise was lost. The humans had moved on instinct, made decisions in seconds, trusted their commanders to be unpredictable. The assembly forces were effective but entirely predictable. And in warfare, predictability was weakness. The crisis in scientific research was perhaps the most troubling of all. Dr. Zell, director of the Assembly Science Council, stood before a gathering of the galaxy's most brilliant minds. Trying to understand why innovation had stopped, we have more researchers than ever, more funding, more facilities. But breakthrough discoveries have dropped by 73% in the past 6 months. A crystalline physicist stood. I have a theory. I analyzed research teams over the past century. 68% of major breakthroughs came from teams that included at least one human. That seems improbable, Dr. Zell said. Humans weren't particularly intelligent compared to other species. No, the physicist agreed. But they approached problems differently. I studied their research notes. They asked questions that seemed irrelevant or even stupid. Questions that violated basic assumptions. She displayed an example. A team of Thorian engineers spent years trying to improve energy shield efficiency through complex mathematics. A human technician on the team asked, "What if shields don't need to be strong everywhere at once?" This question made no sense. Shields should protect equally in all directions. But the question led to adaptive shielding. The physicist continued. Shields that strengthened where attacks were focused and weakened elsewhere, conserving energy. It revolutionized defensive technology. Dr. Zell reviewed dozens of similar examples. Humans asking questions that seemed nonsensical, challenging assumptions that everyone else accepted, proposing ideas that couldn't possibly work, but somehow did. Why did we let them leave? Someone in the audience asked quietly. The chamber fell silent. It was the question everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice. The assembly had voted to remove humanity. They had been so certain it was the right decision. Now the entire galactic civilization was unraveling, and no one knew how to stop it. Chief Administrator Rennick called an emergency session of the full Assembly Council. All 847 representatives gathered, something that hadn't happened in 50 years. The vast chamber hummed with anxious conversations. Rennick began without preamble. We face a systemic crisis. Our medical facilities are overwhelmed. Our industrial operations are failing. Our trade networks are collapsing. Our borders are insecure. Our scientific progress has stopped. He paused, and the chamber went silent. 6 months ago, we removed humanity from the assembly. I believe these events are connected. Impossible. The crystalline representative stood. Humans were a tiny fraction of our population. One species among 847. How could their absence cause such widespread problems? Rennick displayed comparative data. Before human departure, System efficiency across all sectors averaged 94%. Current efficiency is 76% and declining. Before departure, major security incidents averaged 34 per month. We now average 127. Before departure, trade volumes were stable. We've lost 31% of total trade volume. The data scrolled across thousands of displays. The pattern was undeniable. Every metric had worsened after humanity's departure. A Thorian diplomat stood. Administrator, I have been reviewing historical records. Humans were involved in situations across all sectors. They weren't just workers. They were mediators, innovators, problem solvers. They appeared in records everywhere, often in small ways that seemed insignificant at the time. She displayed examples. A human merchant who negotiated a peace treaty between rival colonies while delivering cargo. A human doctor who invented a new surgical technique while treating an emergency. A human engineer who redesigned a factory's workflow while repairing equipment. Humans solving problems that weren't their responsibility, creating connections that weren't official, improving systems without being asked. They were everywhere. The Thorian continued. Not in leadership positions, not in official roles, but everywhere. And everywhere they went, things worked better. Rennick felt something he rarely experienced: uncertainty. The Assembly had governed the galaxy through careful planning, strict protocols, and logical order. Humans had operated through intuition, relationships, and creative chaos. The Assembly had assumed their way was superior. They had been wrong. Junior Administrator Venna stood, her voice trembling slightly. Administrator Rennick, I move that we formally invite humanity to return to the Assembly. The chamber erupted. Half the representatives shouted in agreement. The others defended the original decision. Arguments flew across the chamber, voices rising in anger and fear. Rennick called for order. The motion is on record. We will debate and vote according to proper procedure. The debate lasted 3 days. Representatives argued about pride, about admitting mistakes, about the precedent it would set. Some insisted the problems were temporary. Others warned they were catastrophic. Some blamed humanity for leaving. Others blamed the Assembly for forcing them out. In the end, the vote was called. The motion to invite humanity back passed 723 to 124. Clear supermajority. Rennick drafted the message himself. He spent 5 days choosing every word, trying to balance humility with dignity, apology with hope. The message acknowledged every mistake. It detailed how the galaxy had suffered without humanity. It offered reparations, honors, guarantees. It proposed a new relationship where humans would be valued partners, not barely tolerated members. We were wrong, the message concluded. We underestimated your contributions. We failed to recognize your value. We need you. Please return. The message was transmitted to human space with full diplomatic protocols. Ambassador Venna personally delivered it to the human delegation at the border. She was young for her position, but had been chosen for her humility and sincerity. The human representative who received the message was Ambassador Sarah Johnson, a woman in her 50s, with gray hair and tired eyes. She read the message carefully, then looked at Venna with an expression that was hard to interpret. Thank you for this, Sarah said quietly. It means a great deal that the Assembly has acknowledged its error. I'll present this to our leadership. You should have an answer within a month. A month? Venna had hoped for an immediate acceptance. Ambassador Johnson, our situation is urgent. Every day that passes, more problems emerge. Sarah nodded sympathetically. I understand. But this isn't a decision we can make quickly. Humanity spent 150 years as part of the Assembly. We spent 6 months rebuilding our own civilization. We need time to consider what we want our future to look like. Venna returned to Assembly space and reported the conversation. Rennick felt a growing unease. He had assumed humans would jump at the chance to return, that they would be grateful for the invitation. Sarah Johnson's calm consideration suggested something different. It suggested humans had options. 3 weeks later, the response arrived. It was brief, polite, and devastating. To the Galactic Assembly, it began. We thank you for your invitation and your acknowledgement of our contributions. We have considered your offer carefully. After deliberation, humanity has decided to respectfully decline. Rennick read the words 3 times, unable to believe them. They were saying no. The message continued. We understand the Assembly faces challenges. We are willing to help, but not as members. We propose instead an independent partnership. Human specialists will be available for hire. We will trade freely with Assembly worlds. We will share knowledge and medical advances. We will assist in emergencies. But we will not rejoin the Assembly. We will not place ourselves under Council authority again. The final paragraph struck Rennick like a physical blow. We learned something important during our time away. We learned that we don't need to fit into someone else's vision of what we should be. We can build our own civilization, make our own rules, choose our own path. We hope the Assembly can respect this decision and work with us as equals, not as subordinates. The message was signed by the entire Human Leadership Council. There would be no negotiation, no compromise. Humanity had made their choice. Rennick sat in his empty chamber, the message hovering before him. The Assembly had expelled humanity as an act of mercy, believing they were doing the humans a favor by removing them from a civilization they couldn't properly join. Instead, humanity had discovered freedom. They had learned they were better off outside the Assembly's structure. They had left softly, without protest. And their absence had taught the galaxy a lesson it hadn't wanted to learn. Some species weren't meant to be managed. Some beings thrived best when they chose their own path. And the civilization that tried to force them into molds would lose more than just their contributions. It would lose the chance to learn from them. Rennick understood now what humanity's gentle departure had really meant. It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't weakness. It was confidence. Humans had known they would be fine on their own. They had known the Assembly would eventually realize its mistake. They had left softly because they didn't need to prove anything. Their absence spoke. Loudly enough, the new terms, the news of humanity's refusal, spread across Assembly space like a shockwave. On every world and every station, beings gathered to discuss what it meant. The humans had said no. They didn't want to come back. They were building something of their own in the Assembly Council chamber. Representatives argued for days about how to respond. Some wanted to increase the offer to provide more incentives. Others suggested economic pressure, limiting human access to Assembly markets. A few even whispered about military options, though none dared say it aloud. Chief Administrator Rennick listened to all of it with growing weariness. Finally, he stood and silenced the chamber with a gesture. Enough. We cannot force humanity to return. We cannot pressure them into rejoining. They have made their choice. The only question now is whether we will respect that choice and work with them on their terms, or whether we will let pride destroy us entirely. The chamber quieted. Rennick continued, his crystalline form seeming dimmer than usual. Humanity is offering partnership. Independent partnership. I propose we accept, but they'll be outside our authority. A Kelvin representative protested. How can we ensure they follow proper protocols? We can't, Rennick said simply, and perhaps that's the point. Perhaps protocols aren't as important as we believed. Perhaps having humans work their way, even if it's chaotic and unpredictable, is better than not having them at all. The vote was close, but it passed. The Assembly would accept humanity's terms. They would hire human specialists, trade with human merchants, work alongside human doctors and engineers and diplomats. But humans would operate independently, following their own rules, making their own choices. Ambassador Sarah Johnson received the Assembly's acceptance with quiet satisfaction. She stood in the human diplomatic complex on Earth, looking at reports from across human space. The 6 months since departure had been remarkably productive. Without Assembly restrictions, human innovation had exploded. Engineers were designing technologies that violated a dozen safety protocols but worked brilliantly. Doctors were developing treatments that combined medicines in ways the Assembly considered dangerous, but that saved lives. Merchants were building trade networks based on trust rather than contracts. Sarah called a meeting of human sector leaders. Present in person or via hologram were the people shaping humanity's future. Captain Alina Rodriguez, who commanded the human merchant fleet, Dr. Marcus Kim, who directed medical services, General Patricia Okafor, who led defense forces, Professor Thomas Adiola, who oversaw scientific research, a dozen others, each managing a piece of the new human civilization. The Assembly has accepted our terms, Sarah announced. We'll be working with them again, but as independent partners. What does everyone think? Alina spoke first. My merchants are excited. They miss their friends in Assembly space. They want to go back, but not under Assembly trade regulations. Being independent means we can operate the way we know works. Marcus nodded. Same with medical staff. They want to help, want to treat patients, but they need freedom to use their methods. Assembly protocols are too restrictive. Patricia leaned forward. Defense is more complicated. The Assembly wants us to handle security situations they can't manage. That's fine. But we need to be clear that we choose which missions to accept. We're not their military. We're consultants, Thomas added his perspective. Scientific collaboration could be incredible. Assembly researchers have knowledge we lack. We have creativity they need. If we can work together without being restricted by their bureaucracy, we might achieve breakthroughs neither side could manage alone. Sarah listened to each leader, then summarized. So we're agreed? We go back, but on our terms. We work with the Assembly, not for them. We help where we can, charge fair prices for services, but maintain our independence. Everyone agreed. Within weeks, human ships began appearing in Assembly space again. But they looked different now. The vessels still had human crews, but they flew independent flags. They docked at stations as visitors, not members. They negotiated contracts like any external power. On Helios Nine, Dr. David Chen returned to his medical clinic. He had been hired by the station administration as an independent contractor. His contract gave him complete medical authority, no Assembly oversight, no requirement to follow standard protocols. The Vexorian child Sira came for her first appointment. Her mother cried when she saw David. Dr. Chen, you came back? David smiled. I heard you needed help. How is Sira? Dr. Ven tried to continue your treatment, but there were complications. She's stable, but not improving. David examined the girl, reviewed the records, and immediately saw what had gone wrong. Dr. Ven was skilled, but he had missed the subtle signs that David had learned to watch for. Within 3 days, David had Sira back on an adjusted treatment plan. Within 2 weeks, she was improving again. Dr. Ven observed David's work with a mixture of awe and frustration. How do you know when to adjust the treatment? You don't wait for test results. You seem to just know, David tried to explain. It's about seeing the whole patient, not just the data. The way she holds herself, the energy in her eyes, the way her mother describes her behavior at home, all of it tells me things that tests can't measure. But how can I learn that? Practice, David said. Years of practice. And maybe being willing to trust your instincts, even when they contradict the data. On Karth 7, engineer Sarah Okonkwo returned to the reactor complex as an independent consultant. The facility had experienced 3 more failures in her absence. They were desperate for her help, willing to pay premium rates and give her complete operational authority. Sarah walked through the reactor complex feeling the systems like an old friend. Within an hour, she had identified 17 problems that the Drennan engineers had missed. Some were obvious once she pointed them out. Others were intuitive, based on subtle vibrations and sounds that only she seemed to notice. The Drennan chief engineer watched her work with amazement. You found more problems in 1 hour than our team found in 6 months. Sarah shrugged. You were looking at the data. I was listening to the machine. There's a difference. She trained a new team of engineers, trying to teach them her methods. Some understood. Others remained baffled by the idea of trusting feeling over sensors. Sarah didn't worry about it. She was there to keep the reactor running, not to make everyone think like humans. Across assembly space, similar scenes repeated. Human specialists returned to their old positions, but now they worked on their own terms. They were paid well. They were respected. They were given authority to do things their way, and things started working again. Trade volumes stabilized as human merchants rebuilt their networks. Medical mortality rates dropped as human doctors applied their treatments. Security incidents decreased as human peacekeepers used unpredictable tactics. Scientific breakthroughs resumed as human searchers asked their stupid questions. The galaxy didn't return to exactly how it was before. It became something new, something that acknowledged humans were different, and that difference was valuable. On Unity Prime, Ambassador James Park returned to mediation work. But now, he charged for his services, and beings paid willingly. A Thorian merchant and a Kelvin buyer came to him with a dispute nearly identical to the last one he had mediated before leaving. James listened to both sides, then asked his simple question, "Do you want to work together in the future?" Both parties answered yes. James crafted a solution that preserved their relationship while addressing the immediate problem. Both parties left satisfied. They understood now that James wasn't just applying law. He was protecting something more valuable than being right. He was protecting trust. The most surprising development came from other species. Small, independent worlds watched humanity's example with great interest. If humans could thrive outside the assembly, maybe others could too. The first to leave were the Vorlani, species that had always felt constrained by assembly regulations. They formally withdrew and established independent status. Within a year, 3 more species followed. Chief Administrator Rennick watched this trend with mixed feelings. The assembly was losing members, losing control, but he couldn't deny that the galaxy seemed more vibrant, more dynamic, more alive. Junior Administrator Venna came to his chamber one evening. "Administrator, I've been studying the situation. I think we've been asking the wrong question." "What do you mean?" "We've been asking how to bring humans back into the assembly. We should be asking what humanity's departure taught us about the assembly itself." Rennick gestured for her to continue. The assembly was built on the idea that unity requires uniformity, that all members should follow the same rules, think the same way, operate within the same structures. Humanity challenged that idea. They showed that beings can be part of a community without being identical to everyone else. Venna pulled up data displays. The species that are leaving aren't rejecting the galaxy. They're rejecting forced conformity. They still trade with assembly members. They still cooperate on projects. They still share knowledge. They just want to do it on their own terms. "So you're saying the assembly itself needs to change?" "Yes," Venna said firmly. "We need to become less rigid, more accepting of diversity. Not just physical diversity, but diversity of thought, of methods, of approaches. We need to stop seeing difference as a problem and start seeing it as strength." Rennick considered this. For thousands of years, the assembly had maintained order through uniformity. It had worked mostly. But humanity had shown there was another way. A messier way, a more chaotic way, but perhaps a better way. Over the next 5 years, the assembly underwent slow transformation. Regulations became guidelines. Protocols became suggestions. Member species were given more autonomy to govern themselves as they saw fit. The assembly became less of a controlling authority and more of a coordinating body. Some resisted the changes. Some species left, unable to accept the reduced order. But more species joined, attracted by the new flexibility. The assembly didn't grow larger, but it grew stronger. Humanity remained independent, but deeply connected to galactic civilization. Human ships traveled everywhere. Human specialists worked across dozens of worlds. Human innovations spread through trade and teaching. They were consultants, not members. Partners, not subordinates. Equals. Captain Alina Rodriguez stood on the bridge of her merchant ship, watching a cargo transfer at Crosspoint Alpha. Ken, the young Peluvian dock worker, waved at her from the dock. He had taken a job with her company, preferring to work for humans who valued relationships over protocols. Ambassador. Sarah Johnson met with Chief Administrator Rennick annually to review the partnership between humanity and the assembly. Their meetings were frank, sometimes difficult, but always productive. They had become something unexpected. Friends Dr. Marcus Kim published medical journals that were studied across the galaxy. His papers challenged conventional thinking, proposed radical treatments, and saved countless lives. Some assembly doctors followed his methods. Others didn't. Choice was theirs. General Patricia Okafor trained assembly military officers in human tactical thinking. Her students learned to be unpredictable, to trust instinct, to break doctrine when necessary. Some embraced it fully. Others adapted what worked for them. The galaxy's defenses became more flexible, more effective. Professor Thomas Adela collaborated with alien scientists on projects that pushed every boundary. Together, they achieved breakthroughs that neither side could have managed alone. The key was respect for different approaches, different methods, different ways of thinking. 20 years after humanity's gentle departure, the galaxy was fundamentally different. More diverse, more creative, more alive. The assembly had learned that unity didn't require uniformity, that order could coexist with chaos. That sometimes the most valuable members of a community were the ones who refused to conform. Chief Administrator Rennick, now quite old, gave his final address to the Assembly Council before retiring. His crystalline form had dimmed with age, but his voice remained strong. 20 years ago, we made a decision that nearly destroyed us. We expelled humanity because they didn't fit our vision of what members should be. We believed we were showing mercy. We were actually showing ignorance. He paused, looking around the chamber at representatives from hundreds of worlds. Humanity taught us the most important lesson in our history. They taught us by leaving softly, without anger, without protest. Their gentle departure spoke more loudly than any words could have. It said, "We don't need you to validate us. We know our worth. We'll thrive without you. And if you realize your mistake, we'll consider working together again. But only as equals." Rennick's form glowed slightly brighter as he approached his conclusion. That lesson transformed us. It forced us to question our assumptions, to examine our values, to recognize that our way wasn't the only way. Humanity didn't destroy the assembly. They saved it by teaching us humility. The chamber was silent. Every being present understood the truth of his words. And so, the galaxy learned. Not through force, not through legislation, not through grand proclamations. It learned through the simple act of one species choosing to walk away with dignity to build their own civilization. To demonstrate through example that there was another path. Humanity's soft departure had spoken loudly. It had said, "We are not inferior. We are different." And difference is not a weakness. It's a strength, the galaxy finally heard. And in hearing, it changed. Some lessons can only be taught by absence. Some truths can only be understood when what you took for granted is suddenly gone. Humanity had taught the galaxy its most important lesson, not by being present, but by being willing to leave. They called it mercy when humans left. They realized too late it was a warning that rigid systems break, that forced uniformity weakens, that trying to control what should be free will cost you everything valuable. The humans had known this. They had left softly because they didn't need to prove it. Their absence would prove it for them, and it did.